the most dangerous accounts in an organization are the ones that nobody ever remembers creating. So you walked in, it was just there. We don't know what it does. We're afraid to touch it. Those are the accounts that are going to be the most privileged for the most part. You don't know what they're doing. You don't know why they're there. And nobody has personal accountability for that.
Welcome to Strive, where we explore what it means to be cyber ready, one conversation at a time. Hello, everyone. I'm Vidya, Shankaran, Field CTO at Commvault. And today I'm joined by Dan Conrad, a very good expert in this space around identity. He's a Field CTO, my peer in this space. And together we will explore further on what it means to be cyber ready in the world of identity. So, Dan, thank you for joining us here today. I'm sure you're probably running more and more into these conversations on a daily basis, perhaps even hourly, I would say. In the era of AI-driven automation that we all are in, the traditional notion of perimeter has definitely dissolved. It doesn't hold the same relevance that it did even a couple of years ago, where we considered identity as a final frontier that safeguards an enterprise today. But now when you add to the mix of human identities, the sudden explosion of non-human identities, you have service accounts, you have API keys, OAuth tokens, and not to mention everyone's favorite, the new favorite, AI agents, I think that has created a massive surface area of attack. So what blind spots are you seeing in this space, especially in your conversations? And what does that look like in practice that takes most leaders by surprise?
Things are really changing a little bit towards the concept of identity as the new perimeter, right? I think we've been saying that for a few years, but it's really coming to light. There's companies around identity management, identity governance, and learning what access your identities have is a tricky process. I haven't spoken to a customer that doesn't have a reasonably good idea of how many humans they have in their organization. They're living, breathing. Well, they pay them, and concepts like robotic process automations came around a few years ago, and we started tracking some of that. And then we started giving those robotic processes, back in the day, rights to do things that, even to spawn their own processes or even spawn their own RPAs, right? So AI is the same way. Like, for the years we tracked service accounts in Active Directory or in, systems that are running or on mainframe systems. And all of these service accounts had privileges. If they didn't have privileges, they wouldn't be able to do anything. So in a typical organization of, say, 1,000 people, you may have 10% overhead of just accounts that are designed to do processes outside of human intervention. Whether that's running as a service on a server or executing a script or doing something on a regular interval, they all have to have permissions to do that. What happens is, we've been doing this for 30 years on the same directory systems. There's accounts in there that, we haven't touched in 30 years. And I spoke to a customer literally just 2 days ago, probably. And they had a scenario where they had over 5,000 accounts that were designated as service accounts, but they had no idea who owned them. So their solution was to just disable it and see who calls, right? Because they didn't have any track of where they were actually running, or even, they were looking to us as a resilience company. Can you recover these if we delete them? Because that was one of their other solutions, was to delete them and see if they need them. Odds are, people hadn't used these accounts in a long time. So figuring out what the non-human accounts are is a huge challenge, because you can't just look at a directory and figure that out. And then figuring out what they're actually used for is an even bigger challenge. So, there's solutions for that and ideas that we can put behind that, but we can cover that a little bit later. So that just creates this, blind spot or fog bank that you can't see through, and you really don't know what to do with it when you look at it.
Which is kind of interesting also, Dan, now that you mention about 5,000 accounts that are pretty much flying under the radar at that point, because some of the widely circulated stats around this states that it's a ratio of 144 NHIs to one human identity. That's the mapping that exists as things stand today. And it is definitely alarming because I think we've just about gotten around the fact that, yes, human identities need to be governed, but is that same level of rigor being extended to non-human identities? Because again, often service accounts, those are things that not technically, to your point, is being inventorized, or we don't know where it is being leveraged. So that does create a sense of persistence within an environment, right? If you haven't rotated those credentials, that becomes another opportunity for a malicious actor to technically log in or create an entry point to that environment and move laterally from a human credential that was potentially compromised into the actual tangible target, which is the machine identity, right? So what are you hearing more and more around this space, the way vishing and phishing attacks are definitely hitting the headlines lately, Dan? In terms of the exploits that are leveraged today, where do you see identity ranking across all of that, and especially non-human identities in particular?
Well, you're not going to phish a non-human identity, right? It's not going to click an email and install, malware on a workstation. You're not going to call it on the phone and ask it to, give its credentials. It's not going to happen, right? But those accounts really are the ones you want to go after. So you can theoretically compromise a user account through those traditional methods. And then the directories that we work with today are such that once I've compromised that standard user account, I have visibility into the entire directory. And then I can see perhaps a service account that has privileges that I want to get. So that's what I would, laterally, or, it would be a step up. I would elevate my privileges and be able to impersonate that other account. So the user that I compromised becomes irrelevant at that point. So I'm no longer using that credential. So, cycling that person's password, even deleting their account makes no difference. But once I'm impersonating that privileged account, I really don't even need to know the password depending on how they're authenticating. So if I know their hashes, if I know, certain things about that account, I can still impersonate that account. I used to do old school pass the hash demonstrations for customers. It's a fun little attack to use, Mimikatz, and you just extract a hash. And the question would always come up, how long would it take you to crack the password of that privileged account? Like, why would I want the password? I don't need the password. I don't care what it is. I have the hash. So I don't really need to reverse engineer this hash and go back and figure out, that it was password 123. It doesn't matter. So when I impersonate that privileged account, I can be anyone I want to be based on the privileges of that account. So a lot of times these accounts that were created many, many years ago were severely overprivileged anyway. So, maybe the application they were running under the context of required something that was really high level, or it was very intricate to exactly permission the right things for that account. So you just simply put it in a highly privileged group and call it good. Or there's an alternative to that. And, specifically looking back into my experience in Active Directory, if you don't put it in a privileged group, but you just permission it, it never truly gets identified as privileged, although it is privileged under the covers. So it sort of hides in plain sight and can do anything that someone in a privileged group can do. But at the same time, it's a very dangerous account. So things like, API keys that are hard coding into scripts, OAuth tokens, all of that can be compromised and just used. And the way they got to that is sort of irrelevant anymore because you saw the attack. Maybe you saw the user get phished. You saw them give their password. You quickly change their password. It's game over. It's already happened.
Yeah, I think you and I have definitely talked a lot about the privileged accounts and how it's actually hidden in plain sight. And in fact, talking about the engineering aspect of things, the way there has been a massive industrialization of socially engineered exploits. So there was this fantastic report that I came across rather recently that talks about groups like Shiny Hunters and Scattered Spider that collectively they now have a new moniker, SLH cluster, Scattered Lapses Hunters. And what they do is they have been actively recruiting people just to be able to call organizations and request for that password reset. And to your point, all it takes is just that initial entry point into the organization. And after that, it's game over because the human identity, the human credential is literally a pawn in the larger scheme of things. And those persistent service accounts credentials where the secrets have not been rotated, the passwords have not been rotated, is what the malicious actors are technically going after. So would it be fair to say that by the time the human account is actually remediated, the attacker is well deeply entrenched and embedded within an organization at that point?
Oh, definitely. I mean, we've gone to great lengths to protect the front line. Obviously, we've said this before, this would be a whole lot easier if it wasn't for the users, right? The users are going to be the first line of defense, and the training that goes along with that, and then protecting those identities and everything they do with multi-factor authentication is a very simple way to protect that front line. However, it may be completely impossible to protect everything in your environment with multi-factor authentication. So anytime there's a password or a credential, we've seen the YouTube clips of people standing on the New York subway platforms and buying people's passwords for their corporate networks for $50 or whatever it takes. And you don't really know if they're getting real data, but I'll make up a password for $50. But that kind of mentality still exists because the users don't understand that when they're just opening the front door to their business and letting everybody in, they think their credentials of no value. But once that's compromised, and then and that could be just with AI and automation, that can be milliseconds, right? Because I can compromise a user. As soon as I compromise that user, I'm going to execute a query and find all the privileged accounts, and I'm going to go start gathering intel and then attack that very quickly. So it's not it doesn't take me weeks to gather that intel anymore to figure out what I want to go after. It can be a completely automated process. And, it's sort of that open wound. It's like fixing it after the fact is a good idea, but it should have never happened in the first place.
Agreed. But I think the real world implications of leaving that wound and treating it almost reactively is literally the ground reality of things. Because when I look at some of the financial institutions, their infrastructure, and especially when we talk about the daily operations that we perform with ATM machines, where, yes, those are very sophisticated NHIs, but it's only a question of compromising those NHIs that give you unfettered access to the core banking applications. Or if I were to take a step back and look at the healthcare realm of things, implantable devices where, probably I have a pacemaker, it's only a question of time that gets compromised because it's yet another medical IoT device that's constantly sending out telemetric information. So from that perspective, when you look at the ground reality of things, I completely agree with you that wound should not have taken place at all. It shouldn't have, that incident shouldn't have occurred where identity was leveraged. But the ground reality is that is the very nature of the world that we are in, including agentic, where we just assume that agentic entities are meant to be our extended arms and legs to essentially increase productivity, increase the range of operations that humanly was not feasible in the past, with minimal error that needs to be delivered back to business. I think the risk definitely coexists with the benefits that NHIs have delivered to us. So from that lens of things, the ground reality of the real world challenges of having NHIs available, only begging to be exploited, what are you seeing in this space?
Well, we've spent years trying to come up with ways to protect identities. And, with the continuous stream of new exploits and zero-day attacks, you still have to keep trying, right? You can't just give up. I used to say the best thing you can do is everything you can do. But, when organizations truly start to realize this, and we start to see identities being protected when, cybersecurity insurance demanded it. And, do you have a PAM solution? Do you have multi-factor authentication? All of these ways to integrate. I think organizations really need to embrace this. You can't just buy a piece of technology and expect it to solve a problem. Say a PAM solution, for instance. You have to integrate it into every workflow of your day-to-day administration. You have to integrate it every time, the P part of PAM, privilege, is used. You need to integrate that. You also need to protect that PAM solution on those solutions from the same types of compromises that identity stores would be. So if I can simply compromise an identity that gives me access to your PAM solution, I still own the whole thing anyway. The underlying side of that is identity, right? So the PAM solutions not only are protecting identity, but they're dependent on identity. The same as an identity resilience solution like we offer at Commvault is dependent, for recovering identity, but you have to make sure that the way you're doing it is not also dependent on identity. So you got to go from we protect, but we want visibility into what our vulnerabilities are. We want to be able to say, I'm aware of my vulnerabilities and I'm doing everything I can to protect them, sort of a risk analysis perspective. And I have to accept that level of risk when I need to leave a vulnerability open simply to function. And then you need to, as that safety net, from an identity perspective, you need to be able to rebuild that identity as fast as possible. Because there's always going to be a new 0 day. There's always going to be, you happen to be running on a weird platform that has a strange piece of firmware, and somebody just happened to figure out what that executable was that gave them access to your environment. That's always going to be there. We're always going to have new technology and new vulnerabilities to deal with. So we have to have a way to snap back from that.
I really like one of the key points that you brought up there, Dan, which is like detection does matter because in terms of being able to recover your identity, yes, there are going to be acceptable risk parameters when it comes to risk management across an enterprise itself. But within the identity realm of things, detection definitely helps us because that, to a large degree, has a contributing factor to the recovery with which you can bring back your systems up and running. So, in my assessment or in my view of things, the way I am seeing this entire identity conversation pan out is the recovery first architecture does seem to resonate a lot more. And in terms of having that human to NHI correlation, because a lot of times what happens is not having that one-to-one mapping is definitely is not practical, but at least having a human accountable for a set of NHI entities would definitely bring that much of an accountability to an already existing robust recovery first architecture. So in your perspective, Dan, what are the key difference makers that you think customers should be able to take back coming out of this discussion between us today? Because there, in terms of actionable items, what would you list out as probably the top 3 or top 2 takeaways?
Well, be aware of your non-human identities, things like service accounts and tokens. Just be aware of it. Take a look at it. See what permissions they have. As part of that awareness, if you can associate those to a responsible human or group of humans that have responsibility over those services, for instance, talking about the customer with 5,000 plus accounts that they didn't know where to start and even start organizing. One of the phrases that has come up for years is that the most dangerous accounts in an organization are the ones that nobody ever remembers creating. So you walked in, it was just there. We don't know what it does. We're afraid to touch it. Those are the accounts that are going to be the most privileged for the most part. You don't know what they're doing. You don't know why they're there. And nobody has personal accountability for that. And then embracing the automation piece of that. So bring in those PAM solutions and fully embrace them. Don't do it in 50% of your organization. Do it on every privilege process. And that involves a sort of a religion change from the people that actually use privilege on a day-to-day basis. They need to realize that the right way to do business to protect both the organization and themselves is to embrace privilege management.
I love that. I love that. Thank you so much for sharing that, Dan, because I completely agree with you. What you can see, you can protect or govern. And having said that, thank you so much for joining us here today. And thank you to our viewers for joining us. For any additional reference material around identity resilience guidance and best practice recommendations, they are available on commvault.com/identity-resilience. Look forward to our next conversation here. Thank you.